Welcome to Chess Dog. Today we have a game between Alireza Firouzja and Anish Giri. Unless Magnus Carlsen is playing, you basically cannot get a higher level game than this. Firouzja has the white pieces, Giri has the black. This was at the FTX Crypto Cup. This is a rapid game, 15 minutes for each side with a 10-second increment. Let's jump right in. Firouzja begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, the Spanish opening. a6, not the Berlin, the sharper lines, bishop to a4, knight f6, castles, and bishop to e7. Still mainline stuff, but now Firouzja plays d3. The absolute main line is rook to e1, with the idea of playing c3 and d4 for white. d3 is a little bit slower, a little more maneuvering, but it can still explode in tactics. b5 hits the bishop goes to b3, and now d6 and c3. So basically, this bishop at b3 can now tuck away at c2 if black tries to grab it with knight to a5. Also, d4 can later be played to expand in the center. Castles h3 to control g4, keeps the bishop from pinning. So that bishop goes to b7. Another reasonable idea for black is knight to a5, hitting the bishop, and when the bishop moves c5, gaining space on the queen side. But instead, Anish Giri plays bishop to b7, and he's keeping pressure on e4. The pawn is defended at the moment, but by keeping pressure on it, it limits white's options and makes it hard to play d4 later. a4. So Firouzja tries to create a weakness on the queen side. These pawns have been advanced, and if he can take on b5, the b5 pawn could become a weakness. Knight to a5, and here's the game's novelty. Firouzja plays bishop to a2. Before, only the move bishop to c2 had been played. But bishop to a2 makes a lot of sense. I mean, he basically just keeps the bishop on its most active diagonal, a very logical move. c5 gaining space, and now knight to a3, putting more pressure on this b5 pawn that he's been targeting. Queen to d7 helps defend that pawn. Now he ignores the pawn and plays the bishop to g5. He puts some pressure on the knight at f6. Maybe he'll take it later, but he actually has a different idea in mind. And to relieve the pressure on the b5 pawn, Giri goes ahead and just takes on a4. He creates weaknesses here, of course, but now he might be able to jump into the b3 square and use that extra pawn, maybe give it back in a point in the game when it's convenient for him. Now knight to h4. We begin to see Firouzja's attacking formation get started. He wants to play the knight to f5 and then play f4, opening up lines for this rook on the king side, a pretty standard approach to attacking the king in the Spanish or also in the Italian game. Rook a to b8. Giri lines up against this weak pawn on b2. Now knight to f5, threatening to take on e7, getting the two bishops. Also, they would make this pin with this bishop on g5 much more potent if that bishop were taken. So Giri just tucks it back at d8. He doesn't want it captured, but now f4, looking to open up the f-file for the rook and the rest of the heavy pieces. Pawn takes, rook takes. Now knight to b3, using this weak square to basically kill the a2 bishop. So Firouzja just goes ahead and takes the knight. Leaving the knight there would be too much trouble. He had to move the rook, lose too much time. So bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and now black does have the two bishops, but Firouzja is building up a ferocious attack on the king side. The queen goes to f3, building up pressure on this f6 knight, and here the knight moves to e8 because the pressure is actually too great. What Firouzja is threatening is knight to h6 check, one of his threats. And obviously, if he just takes the knight, then white would take the knight at f6, and black would be in huge trouble. So if he plays king to h8 to try to survive, bishop takes knight, and after bishop takes, rook takes. And white just wins a piece here because black cannot retake the rook. If he takes the rook, then queen f6, and that's actually mate. So he's threatening to win a piece. And Giri, seeing this, moves the knight back to e8. Bishop takes bishop. Now the two bishop advantage is gone, and the dark squares can be more vulnerable. Rook takes, now queen to g3, with all kinds of pressure against g7. It's defended by the knight at e8 at the moment, but this knight could become overloaded, and black's king become under a lot of pressure. f6, rook a to f1, doubling on the f-file. Now bishop to c8. He wants to basically move the queen out of the way and then chop off this very well-placed knight on f5. And here's where we ask ourselves a strategic question about Firouzja's position with the white pieces. What is his worst placed piece? This is a very important strategic question. What is my worst placed piece? And you can look at this position. It's pretty obvious, right? It's this knight over here on a3. So Firouzja decides to get the knight involved in the action. The knight goes to c4 with the idea of coming into e3, or it could back up the f5 knight or even go to d5 itself. Queen to b7 clears for the bishop. Knight c to e3. Now bishop to e6. Rook 4 to f3. Now a5. So Giri does have some potential pressure on the queen side. If he can break at a3, then this pawn at b2 could make some threats to queening. So Firouzja, seeing that, just says, I'm going to go ahead and play rook to a1, stop that immediately, actually threatening to take the pawn. The pawn is defended, now d4 expanding in the center. Pawn takes and knight takes, hitting the bishop at e6, so the bishop tucks back, but now knight to d5 with a dual threat. Obviously, he's threatening the queen. He's also threatening to take on f6 because the queen is pinning that g7 pawn. So he's threatening to take on f6, knight takes, rook takes, win a pawn. So bishop takes d5, e d5. And that square at e6 is a juicy, juicy square. Not only is it weak, supported by a pawn, but at the moment it's threatening a fork of both rooks and the queen. So Giri deals with that by playing queen to c5, which pins the knight and also attacks the d5 pawn. The king gets out of the pin, king to h2, but now he is able to take the pawn. And black has a two-pawn advantage here, but Firouzja's kingside pressure more than makes up for that two-pawn deficit for white. Rook to f5 hits the queen, queen to f7. Now rook a5 already regains one of the pawns and is threatening to get on the 7th rank. Giri plays the rook to d7 to sort of neutralize that. Now the knight goes to f5 with the huge threat of knight to h6 check, which would fork the king and queen. The pawn would not be able to take the knight again because the queen is pinning the g7 pawn. So that's a very serious threat. Giri plays the king to h8 to remove that pin. Rook to e1, g6 kicks the knight, but weakens the king cover. Knight to d4. The knight can go into e6, perhaps. Knight to g7 covers that square. The knight could also go to f5 at some point later. Queen to f3, d5. Rook to a6, piling up on the f6 pawn. And here Giri makes a pretty bad mistake. He plays rook to b8. Now he's up a pawn, so maybe he thinks he can give away the f6 pawn for counterplay. But now, after rook takes f6, black is in big trouble. Queen moves to g8, rook to f1, tripling on the f-file, rook d to d8, knight to c6, forking the two rooks. Now the material advantage begins to take epic proportions. Knight goes to f5, knight takes rook, rook takes knight. Now g4, kicking the knight away. The queen goes to d8. Instead of moving the knight, he counterattacks the rook at f6. The rook goes to e6. Knight g7 hits the rook, and now rook e5, piling up on the weak d5 pawn. Queen to d6, pins the rook to the king, but he just takes with the queen. And he's fine. The queen goes to c7. Giri knows a trade of queens would be over. I mean, the endgame would be instantly lost, so he cannot allow that. But Firouzja wants it, so he keeps trying to force the trade of queens. Queen to d8, rook to d5, hitting the queen again. Queen e8, queen to f2. He wants to keep the queen back here to avoid any silly checks against the king that could cause trouble. Rook to a8, rook to e1, hitting the queen again. Queen to b8 check. He self-pins his rook, but his material advantage is so great, he'll just move the king, and then the rook will become unpinned later. Queen to g8, queen to e2, tripling again, rook a2, rook e4, queen to b8 check, king g2, queen c8, and rook to f1, and now king to g8, rook to d4, and queen to c3. And it looks like, maybe he's getting something. I mean, the pawn is pinned. If he takes the queen, black would take white's queen, and who knows, this b3 pawn might get somewhere. The problem is, it's mate in 3. Rook to d8 check. And he plays the only available move, knight to e8. Queen takes. Actually, to be honest, Giri resigned in this position, but the mate was knight to e8, queen takes, king g7, and queen to f8 mate. Now, even after this great game from Alireza Firouzja, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. If you want to see more great chess from Alireza Firouzja, be sure to check out this video right here. I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy it.